Hello, my name is Jay Ganamano, and today I'm going to be going over operant conditioning in the television show Ed, and Eddy. So, the goals of this presentation is to fully understand, well, what is operant conditioning, um, how does it correlate to this television show, this cartoon, and also why it's important for us as everyday individuals. How is it practical? How do we use it in our everyday lives? So, in order to understand operant conditioning in full, it's important that we look at reward and punishment because these are two aspects that are very much big in terms of how operant conditioning works. So there's positive reinforcement, positive punishment, negative reinforcement, and negative punishment. So I'm going to be actually going more into this later in the presentation. And I know that this is kind of a bit of a confusing, concept to get around. But I just wanted to briefly introduce reward and punishment, right? So for the show, essentially, there's going to be an added punishment, right? And that's going to be to try and decrease the behavior of the stimulus, right? So, who created operant conditioning? I think it's important to know the history of operant conditioning because then we can give credit to the person who created it and how we got here. So, operant conditioning was created by B.F. Skinner. He started with the Skinner box. And then two important behaviors I thought were interesting were respondent behaviors and operant behaviors. Because I know sometimes in psychology, where does the whole instinct versus learned debate happen? So essentially, what respondent behaviors do is that they're almost instinctual. So you don't have to think to actually do these behaviors. So that would be like when a doctor hits you in the knee and your leg flies up, or when your hand is over a hot stove and you quickly take your hand away. That would be a respondent behavior. Operant behavior, it has to be learned, meaning there has to be some sort of conditioned or unconditioned stimulus, right? There has to be some sort of, um, you know, like, yeah, really just stimulus that takes place. Um, so the Skinner box is very famously known. It's about the mouse who he had a lever, and the mouse would pull down the lever to receive a food pellet. If he didn't, then he would get shocked. And so him being shocked was the negative reinforcement, and then obviously him pulling down the lever and the food coming out was the positive reinforcement. So, how does operant conditioning relate to this cartoon? So, in the show, um, and here are our characters, you have Double D, Ed, and Eddie. Hence why the show is called Ed, Ed, and Eddie. So, Double D is kind of like our instructor here. He's the one conducting the operant conditioning. And then Ed and Eddie are kind of like his lackeys or the test subjects, right? So, Ed and Eddie have quite a bit of disruptive behaviors that Double D wants to get rid of. So what Double D does is he puts band-aids on the back of the two Eds' heads. And so whenever they do a bad behavior, he rips off the band-aids off the back of their head, right? So that's a negative reinforcer, right? Because he's adding the band-aid. To the back of their heads. And so, that is like the negative reinforcement is that, well, if you don't do the right behavior, if you're acting up, I'm going to rip the band-aid off. And that's exactly what Double D does. And, quickly they're laughing, they're making fun of the experiment, and then band-aids are getting ripped off their head, and they're slowly learning, and they're slowly joking less and less. And finally, Eddie is actually conditioned. He sees Double D's hand reach for Eddie's the back of his head to grab the band-aid and rip it off. So he was about to continue doing negative behavior, but he saw the hand. He was conditioned. He knew that if Double D's hand was ready to rip the band-aid off the back of his head, it was gonna hurt. So he quickly changed his behavior to match the desired behavior that Double D wanted, and that was being good. Um, and that's really just the simple way of how operant conditioning works. And then obviously, his friend Ed saw that Eddie didn't get hurt, and so he then also started acting good, with good behavior. Um, so going forward, or moving on, you can see this chart, and this chart really better explains everything, where you can have positive punishment, positive reinforcement, negative punishment, and negative reinforcement. And so it's a little confusing, but the way you can think about it is positive, you're adding something, and then negative, you're taking away something. And then with punishment, right? A punishment, you're trying to decrease the behavior. So, and then reinforcement, right? When you reinforce something, you're also adding something. So it's kind of like you have positive punishment, meaning you're adding a punishment. So that would be like, if if someone got disciplined, smacked, you're adding a punishment, right? Whereas positive reinforcement would be like giving more food to a dog because they did well. Negative punishment would be taking away something to decrease the behavior. So that would be like taking away a Game Boy or a video game or a toy to a child. You're taking it away because you're saying you're not allowed to have this now that you're doing this bad behavior, and you'll get it back when you do. And then negative reinforcement is taking away something to increase behavior, right? So that could be really like a similar situation, or it could be having like less food, or less money each week. It would be like, well, you're not really performing the way I want you to, so I'm going to take away money that I give you each week to bring in the garbage can, and when you start performing better, then I'll start giving you more money back. Something like that. Why does operant conditioning matter? So the reason operant conditioning matters so much is because we're constantly studying the brain. Psychologists are kind of like the Aristotle of science. We still know very little about the brain, and we're constantly getting things wrong, which is why we're trying to figure out more about it. That's why operant conditioning is really such a good first step, because it kind of defines, well, how do we learn these things, and it explains why we're not like robots, and how we have emotions and we have senses, and we have we look at reward and punishment and motivation and learning, and it's all very important in terms of, especially even like the efficiency of work, right? Everybody has to work, so operant conditioning is important in terms of, well, how much do I pay my employees to work for me? If I give them more money, will they work harder, or will they become lazy and they're not going to work as hard? And then do I add punishments? There's all these things to consider. It's important to understand the mechanisms of how people work in the workplace, how children function, and then really just being the most efficient at making people just kind of function in everyday life, because there's obviously plenty of people who struggle to function in everyday life, and I think that's why operant conditioning is so important, is because we can use reinforcements to deter bad behaviors, and taking away things to deter bad behaviors, as well as adding things to further people's good behaviors, and also adding or even taking away certain things to motivate people, because people are motivated sometimes when things are taken away. So with all of this said, this concludes my presentation. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you understand a little bit more about operant conditioning. Take care, guys.